Good day. Over the last couple of hours, we have had eyewitness reports from Russian war correspondents detailing the state of the fighting in places like Bakhmut and Solidar. Now, I should say, in parenthesis, that the quality of war reporting, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, has been extremely high, and that both sides have been able to deploy journalists, there have been journalists who have deployed right on the front lines and do the kind of thing that Western journalists of another time, in the Second World War, even during the Vietnam War, also did, which is go together with the troops into the battle and actually report the state of the battle from the actual front lines, with the bullets and the shells falling amongst them. It's a very, very long time since I've seen Western reporters do anything like that to any degree, and they've certainly not been doing it, as far as I can see, in the fighting in Ukraine. Most war reporting you see in the Western media about the war in Ukraine seems to take place from long distance back offices in places like Kiev, Lviv, and of course Western capitals. Of course, in addition, I have to say about myself, I too am not a war reporter. I'm not there on the battle lines, but then I've never pretended to be a war reporter in any detail. And I hope I've always made clear when I've got information which isn't corroborated, I tend to say as much. Anyway, beyond that, we've now, as I said, got eyewitness reports from, in this case, Russian journalists who are fighting with the troops, not, in this case, it seems Russian troops, but troops of the militia, the Donbass militia, and they confirmed what other reports had been suggesting for some time, that Russian and Russian allied troops from the militia, from the Wagner group, are now heavily engaged in fighting in Bakhmut and Solidar. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of all of this. I'm probably not the person to discuss this fighting in detail, but we can say that it's now fighting that's moving beyond the suburbs of these two towns. Solidar, perhaps, is better understood as a suburb of Bakhmut, but regardless, that we're now beyond the actual suburbs. We're now starting to see fighting well within these two towns. And interestingly, on this occasion, the Russians have done the reverse of what they did in Mariupol and Severodonetsk. Instead of attacking the residential areas of the town first and moving on to the industrial areas, they've done what they did in Lysychansk. They've cleared or are clearing the industrial areas before they move deeper into the residential areas of these two places. And in the case of Bakhmut, it seems that this advance that's taking place along the Patrice-Lumumba highway, it has so far been principally an advance through the industrial areas, the small factories and workshops and industrial facilities that cluster around these towns in Donbass. As I've discussed many times, Donbass is an area which bears some resemblance to the Ruhr in Germany. It consists of basically dozens of small towns with factories of various sizes, often historically, I suspect, attached to coal mines, which are also very common in this area. That these little factories, sometimes quite big factories, sometimes as in the case of the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, huge factories, but these factories, all together with these towns, make a dense network of built-up areas, which explains much of the pattern of the fighting that we have seen in Donbass over the last few weeks. Now, there's been some reports now from Twitter and such places from people on the very much on the Ukrainian side of the battle, which are essentially admitting that the fall of Bakhmut is now only a matter of time. And in addition to this pressure on Bakhmut and Solidar, and by the way, on the topic of Solidar, I'm now getting reports that Ukrainian troops, some Ukrainian troops, have withdrawn into the salt mine near Solidar. This is a gigantic salt mine, one of the biggest, not just in Europe, but apparently in the world. And it's not just a salt mine, it's also apparently something of a tourist attraction. But anyway, regardless, some Ukrainian troops in Solidar have apparently retreated into this salt mine, in other words, into an underground area. And I have to say, as I always do, as somebody who finds underground situations difficult at the best of times, that if they do get trapped there, I hope that they surrender, because I can't imagine personally a more grisly fate than to be caught underground, in caverns underground, and to be tracked down and basically killed by Russian special forces, or worse still, to die of heat and thirst and food exhaustion, trapped underneath the ground in these sort of places. But regardless, it seems Bakhmut, Solidar are close to falling. Again, I'm not going to say exactly how quickly they will fall. Last week, an official of the Lugansk People's Republic anticipated that Solidar would fall by last Sunday. Well, that clearly, obviously hasn't happened, but it does seem as if this area, this key area of what some are referring to somewhat extraordinarily, in my opinion, as the Zelensky defense line, this key area, this linchpin of this defense line, is now cracking. And not just this key area, Bakhmut, Solidar, but it seems that further north in Siversk, the Russians have suddenly reactivated their forces, and they're now fighting more aggressively, with a view obviously to capturing Siversk too. Now, as I've said in previous videos, I think this is the main remaining key defense line that Ukraine has in Donbass. The Ukrainian concentrations in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and some of the accompanying towns were not, in my opinion, intended to be fortified defense lines of the sort that we've been hearing about and dealing with up to now. Rather, they have been the place where Ukraine has positioned its long-range artillery, its reserve troops that it would send to reinforce the front lines, and of course where the command headquarters were located. And I'm not saying, as I said, that Slavyansk and Kramatorsk cannot be defended and won't be defended, but I suspect that cracking the defenses of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will prove easier to do than it has been for the Russians and their allies to get through these successive defense lines which were created to shield the Ukrainian controlled areas of Donbass, and by the way also to provide a base area for attacks on the separatist controlled areas of Donbass. It's going to be easier to capture Slavyansk and Kramatorsk than to capture these much more fortified areas in which the fighting has been taking place up till now. On the topic of the fortified areas that the Russians are breaking through, there's been more information about continued Russian advances near Pesky, this large village, small town if you wish, which had become very much a key fortified point in the most heavily fortified parts of the Ukrainian defense lines opposite the city of Donetsk, which the Russians have cracked over the last 3 weeks, largely, in my opinion, and in fact the opinion of increasing numbers of people, because the Ukrainians most unwisely withdrew artillery and infantry from these defense lines as part of this offensive on Kherson, of which at the moment we see no sign. I'll come back to that in a moment. But anyway, there's been some absolutely dramatic, perhaps even horrifying video footage from what I believe is Persky. Now, in an earlier video, I discussed the Russian flamethrower multiple launch rocket system, the TOS-1, which, by the way, there's now an even more advanced version, the TOS-2, which the Russians have been increasingly deploying in Donbass, and which they use to attack fortified positions and trenches. And if you remember, some weeks ago, the Military Summary Channel spoke about the devastating effectiveness of this system in destroying fortified positions and trenches, and the extent to which Ukrainian troops are extremely frightened of this system. I made the point in the video when I discussed this report from the Military Summary Channel that one mustn't make the mistake of thinking of the TOS system as a wonder weapon any more than one should think of the HIMARS system, about which, by the way, we're hearing a great deal less over the last couple of days, but that's another matter. But anyway, one shouldn't think of these systems as wonder weapons in themselves. But clearly, the TOS system is exceptionally effective. And I would say, I'm going to repeat a point which I made previously. I think in actually changing the outcome of battles, of making an actual difference on the battlefields, the TOS-1 and the TOS-2 have made a significantly greater difference than the HIMARS systems have made. I doubt myself that the HIMARS have actually made much significant difference at all. And this film, which I've seen, of what appears to be an attack on Persky, on the northern, a belt of large, big apartment buildings in the northern area of Persky, big concrete buildings, the sort that one could easily turn into fortified points, and which the Ukrainians have apparently used as fortified points. Well, this film shows the devastating power of these TOS systems. I mean, you see rockets fall on these buildings, you see fires break out and explosions, and eventually the whole area of these buildings becomes engulfed in flames and explosions. I have to say, watching this film, I was profoundly moved and distressed to think of the fate of any Ukrainian soldiers who might have been in those buildings. It must be absolutely horrifying to be subjected to a bombardment by systems of this kind. And I'm afraid that any Ukrainian defense line will face attack from these systems. And people who, perhaps rightly, in fact, who undoubtedly rightly criticize Ukrainians for trying to put some of their military positions close to civilian areas. Well, again, I want to stress I'm not in any way justifying something which is obviously wrong, but one can begin to understand the rationale when one sees film of this TOS system in action. Because the point about these residential buildings, which have been turned into fortresses, is that they were apparently emptied of their inhabitants years ago, when the Ukrainians converted the whole of Persky into essentially a fortified area. So this means that the Russians have no inhibitions about using their TOS systems to clear them. And one can see the devastating effect. If the Ukrainians don't use civilians as human shields, which, as I said, I want to stress I'm not in any way justifying, but if they don't use civilians as human shields, their soldiers presumably would become subjected more frequently to attacks by systems like the TOS, and of course the TOS system itself, with all the devastating consequences for those soldiers that one can see in this video. So again, I want to stress this is not in any way to justify what is undoubtedly an inappropriate use of civilians as human shields, which is, by the way, a war crime. It's simply to provide some kind of explanation for why it might be done. Now, that all points again to the underlying truth of this war, which is that the Russians are now, I think, within distance, visual distance, of breaking the Zelensky line and of closing in on these remaining Ukrainian concentrations in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and in fact of finally clearing the Donbass. And of course, once they do that, then the major fortified area built up by Ukraine will have fallen under Russian control. And Ukraine will have lost its key defense line. It can perhaps try to build up some kind of defense along the Dnieper River. But of course, the Russians are west of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, which is one reason, by the way, the main reason, I suspect, why there's been all this talk about this counteroffensive in Kherson. And of course, they also have troops, the Russians also have troops west of the Dnieper River in Belarus, and of course, in the event that all the territories east of the Dnieper River, which would include Kharkiv and Sumy and Chernigov and all the rest, and of course Zaporozhye in the south, once all of these places are cleared, if the Russians want to advance west of the Dnieper River, they're already located in the south, in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, and they could, in theory, at least, and probably in fact, advance again west of the Dnieper River from Belarus, which would be, I suspect, it would create a crisis for the Ukrainian military if and when the Russians ever do decide to do that. And that, of course, brings me back to the topic of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region. Now, today's the 12th of August. There's still sometimes rumors, discussions, speculations about a Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region. But the time window for bringing it is now starting to close. And there's really no sign of this offensive getting underway. And there's been more and more doubts by people like Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor. There's been more doubts, and Scott Ritter, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Ritter, all of these US military officers. They've been, all of them, increasingly skeptical that Ukraine has the forces to launch a counteroffensive in Kherson region. And in fact, what we saw was that the attempt by the Ukrainians to build up a strike force to advance on Kherson by redeploying troops from Donbass and withdrawing artillery from Donbass and redeploying it to Kherson region, all that did was bring Ukrainian troops to Kherson region, where they were more exposed to Russian missile attacks, since they were no longer protected in their trenches and bunkers in Donbass, so that they actually suffered heavier losses from Russian missile strikes. And of course, it also stripped the defense lines opposite Donetsk of troops and artillery, which of course enabled the Russians to make their important breakthrough in Pesky. So we have instead a situation where it's increasingly looking as if this offensive has either been delayed or perhaps more realistically where it's been completely called off. And what we are seeing instead are intensified Ukrainian artillery strikes on the Zaporozhye nuclear reactor. Now, this isn't, of course, located in Kherson region, but it is located east of the Dnieper River, in the area east of the Dnieper River, opposite the still Ukrainian-controlled town of Nikopol, which is west of the Dnieper River. And, of course, it's the largest nuclear power station in the world. Now, I understand that there's been a great deal of obfuscation about who exactly is carrying out the shelling of this nuclear power station. But personally, I don't think there's any doubt at all that it's the Ukrainians. The Russians occupied the power station, so why should they shell it? And I understand that at the UN Security Council debate, which took place yesterday, to discuss the shelling, which, by the way, I have not read the actual reports of, but I understand that no one disputed that it was Ukraine that was shelling the nuclear power station at Zaporozhye, except the Ukrainian delegate. Now, as I said, I want to stress again, that's something I've obtained from second hand. I don't know for a fact that it's true, but it seems plausible. So, on the assumption that the Ukrainians are shelling the nuclear power station, why are they doing it? Well, I'm going to venture a guess. I'm going to make a guess that this is a substitute for the Kherson counteroffensive. The point about the Kherson counteroffensive was obviously to win back territory from the Russians, to give the people in the West an impression that Ukraine was still in the fight, that it is still advancing, that it's still able to win victories against the Russians. There hasn't been any Ukrainian ground victory of significance, or what can be passed off as a Ukrainian ground victory of significance, since the Russian withdrawal from Kiev and its pressings at the end of March. So it's understandable, perhaps, that the Ukrainians want to encourage their public, encourage their soldiers, encourage their Western supporters with the appearance of some kind of a victory by carrying out some kind of, arranging for some kind of a victory in Kherson region. Well, since this isn't going to happen, or since it's looking increasingly unlikely that this is going to happen, they are now trying to come up with something else. And that brings us to the second reason why the Ukrainians might be shelling the nuclear power station. Because there's growing numbers of reports that the Russians are planning to hold referenda in the Zaporozhye, the part of Zaporozhye region which they control, and in Kherson region, referenda to decide whether or not these territories should join Russia, that the Russians are planning to do that in September. And the military summary channel, in its latest report, suggested that the date for these referenda is now fixed for the 11th of September. And possibly, in fact, very plausibly, one of the motivations for the Kherson counteroffensive was to disrupt these referenda, to prevent people in these regions, or to dissuade people in these regions from participating in these referenda, so that the legitimacy, which of course will not be accepted anyway, of these referenda will not be accepted anyway by Ukraine or by the by Western governments, but that the legitimacy of these referenda will be further damaged by perhaps very low turnouts. Well, it seems to me that if you can create a nuclear accident in this area, causing people to remain at home because they might fear radioactive contamination, well, that might be a way of disrupting these referenda if you can't launch a counteroffensive in this area as well. So that may be the rationale for these missile and artillery strikes on the Zaporozhye power station. Now, I want to stress again, this is my guess, my opinion. It's not a fact. Obviously, the Ukrainian High Command does not share its plans with me, but it seems to me as plausible a guess as any. What I would say is that I've now read what looks like a detailed analytical study of the state of this power station, and the view of the people who've written it is that the amount of damage to the actual nuclear power facilities in this power station that this Ukrainian shelling can do is not going to be such as to cause significant damage or really dangerous damage to this facility. There's been some suggestions that the Ukrainians might be able to knock out the refrigeration plant, but that would not cause a nuclear accident as such. It would rather cause the power station to close. And since the power station is still providing electricity to the Ukrainian electricity grid, that might not be a particularly wise thing for Ukraine to do, but that's another matter. There's also a lot of reports that there's a large dump of spent nuclear fuel in this area. Apparently much of it is in wooden boxes with a plywood cover, and there's some Russian commentators who say that this is all the fault of the American company Westinghouse. Well, that may or may not be true. I don't know one way or the other. One mustn't assume that it's the Americans who are to blame for everything. But anyway, there's reports that there's spent nuclear fuel there contained in these containers, and that the purpose of the shelling is to cause this fuel to leak, and that this might also cause a radioactive problem. Well, again, this same report that I've read casts doubt upon that. It suggests that even if shells landed amongst this fuel, it could not do the kind of damage that some people are saying. It would not be a major radioactive leak. It would be certainly nothing comparable to the Chernobyl affair. And suggestions that it would be, it seems, are simply wrong. Now, I am not an expert on this topic, obviously. I'm not any kind of engineer, let alone a nuclear engineer, and I'm certainly not somebody who knows much about radioactivity or nuclear waste. So anybody who knows more about this is welcome to write on the thread of this video or to contact me some other way and to point out where all this might be wrong. But as I said, for what it's worth, I thought that this report looked reasonably plausible. Anyway, there we go. The Russians, by the way, are saying that their air defenses around this Zaporozhye plant have been strengthened, and that increasingly Ukrainian missiles and shells are not getting through. And by the way, the Russians have also been saying that they're gradually and successfully getting a handle on the HIMARS strikes on the bridges in Kherson region, and that there also the damage is now also being contained as well. Well, there we go. Now, that brings me, this business about Ukrainians not sharing their battle plans, now brings me to a report of an order that President Zelensky has made, and he's apparently issued an order to Ukrainian officials saying that their sharing of Ukrainian battle plans with the media is completely irresponsible. Now, parts of the media have suggested that this is something to do with the explosions at the Russian airbase in Crimea at Saki, that Zelensky is somehow angry that Ukrainian officials have been going out, fanning out, talking to the media, telling them that Ukraine was somehow responsible for that fire, those explosions at that airbase, whereas the official Ukrainian position is that they had nothing to do with it. Now that may be true, and there might be good reasons why Zelensky might be angry with those officials for spreading that story, or rather for confirming or appearing to confirm that Ukraine was responsible for those fires and those explosions at the airbase. And the reason might be obviously that if there was sabotage involved in causing those explosions and that fire at the airbase, then of course that has what those Ukrainian officials have been saying will have basically confirmed the Russians in that knowledge, and given the very serious breach in security of the airbase, no doubt the Russians are now carrying out a thorough investigation and are hunting down the perpetrators. They must have had, if there were saboteurs responsible, they must have had some kind of access to the base and some kind of inside help, and that will have compromised whichever the Ukrainian officials talking in that way will have compromised the Ukrainian operatives working at the base, the air base, and would have put them in an extremely dangerous position. In fact, I'm going to guess that if there were such operatives, the Russians are probably within measurable distance of finding out who they were. It can't be especially difficult to do that. However, that assumes that the incident at Saki really was sabotage. Now, in my previous video, I thought that it was more likely to be an accident due to someone's negligence. But I've since received an email from a very reliable and very fully committed member of our Duran community, Zarael to be precise, who has told me the following. He says, as an officially designated fire brigade soldier of the German Army's flight wing, I had to go through extensive training to be able to fight fires of all aviation vehicles. As I'm also very familiar with IEDs, improvised explosive devices, SDD-shaped OEDs, etc., I know what I'm looking at, and these videos from all angles which I see sadly do not show the actual moment of detonation, but the smoke pillar rising with the orange-red burn is definite evidence of a fuel burn. In my personal and operational opinion, any other press release is diverting the truth. It could well be a sabotage act which ignited a fuel tank, which air bases have a multitude of. So this person, with his technical background, appears to think that sabotage is a very real possibility. Doesn't say that that's definitely the case, but this person appears to incline more to the sabotage theory. I'm not going to argue with that. I don't have the technical knowledge to. I would simply reiterate that if Ukraine is operating saboteurs or insiders within a Russian airbase, a military airbase, that is a major security breach, and the Russian authorities will be extremely concerned about it. I would add, of course, that there's also a possibility that it wasn't Ukrainians at all, and that it might have been someone from Western intelligence involved? If so, then I suspect the Russians will be even more worried. And as I said, you can be sure that a very, very thorough investigation is underway to find out both who was involved in this breach and how it took place, and to tighten up security on all of these bases. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, coming back to Zelensky's comment, the other possibility is that what Zelensky's referring to when he says that people should not blab about Ukrainian operational plans was not so much the story of the affair in Saki, in the airbase in Crimea, but rather the Kherson counteroffensive. Of course, it has been massively embarrassing for Ukraine if, having talked so much about this Kherson counteroffensive, no such counteroffensive actually takes place. So it's perhaps understandable that Zelensky might, in that case, be telling all of his various officials, for heaven's sake, stop talking in this way about plans that we might have. What you've done is you've informed in advance, informed the Russians in advance of the fact that we were intending to carry out an offensive in Kherson region. The result is that the Russians have massively reinforced in this very region. The result is that our forces in Kherson region have been severely depleted, or at least in Nikolaev region, the forces that were going to be carrying out this offensive have been massively depleted as a result of missile strikes. And the result is that we've had to call off this offensive, or at least postpone it, which has been massively embarrassing for us. It's been humiliating for us. It's upset our Western backers. And of course, it's demoralizing our military and our own civilian population. And I have to say, on balance, that makes rather more sense to me than to think that Zelensky's comments were about the assault, if it was an assault, or the sabotage action, if it was a sabotage action, or the fire, or whatever it was, at the Saki airbase. Anyway, that's my own view. As I said, others can take issue with it as they please. So, to summarize, it's looking increasingly as if Bakhmut is perhaps not on the brink of falling, but that we could very well see the collapse in Bakhmut within a measurable distance of time. And at that point, the Ukrainians in Donbass will have their backs literally to the wall. Well, not literally, but metaphorically to the wall. They'll be thrown back onto the last areas that they control of any significance, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and these may not be as defendable as the defense lines we've seen up to now. In other words, the Battle of Donbass, the Battle of the Donbass Operational Arc, as I understand the Russians refer to it, may soon be over. And that would be the end of phase 2, possibly the most protracted part of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. And that would then open up possibilities for the Russians to launch phase 3 and phase 4. And we're getting lots of reports now of the Russians busy recruiting volunteer units across Russia to build up their forces in Ukraine. Apparently, the plan now is to carry out further Russian offensives deeper into Ukraine. That probably wasn't the plan at the start. My sense is that the plan at the start was to clear Donbass, but now it's looking as if the Russians may be starting to think beyond Donbass, in which case they may need more troops than they've deployed in Ukraine up to now, and that may very well be the reason why new forces are being raised in Russia. And we'll probably be seeing them come into their own within the next few weeks and months once the Battle of Donbass is ended. Now, I will just finish this summary of military news in Ukraine by saying that a Marine officer, a US Marine officer, who's written under the pen name of Marinus, so we don't know who he is, has now written a very interesting discussion of the war in Ukraine, and he has taken the diametrically opposite view of the Russian conduct of that war. And this is, by the way, apparently for a US Marine publication. He's apparently taken the diametrically opposite view about this war than you find in much of the Western media and which you find in British military of defence bulletins. He says that the Russians have conducted this war up to now with great skill, that they have carried it out, conducted it very much in a way which is very much consistent with their operational philosophies and with the way of war, the Russian way of war, which basically crystallized around the time of the Second World War, and that they've actually expanded the envelope about how to conduct these military operations. And he's spoken very highly of the Russian ability to conduct long-range strikes against enemy formations and infrastructure and military industrial complexes using missiles. So it's actually a very interesting, very erudite article. I'm afraid I can't provide a link because, as I said, it's apparently in a military publication and it's not open access, but I have seen extracts of it which have been floating around significantly and perhaps unsurprisingly on Russian channels. So we see that some people in the US military, at least, have serving US military, not retired officers like Daniel Davis and Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter but some serving officers have a very different perspective on the war than the one you normally hear if you're getting all your news from the media. Anyway, there are other things going on in the world, and we now see what I suspect is an extremely important development about to happen. And I'm going to touch on it very briefly because this has already been a longish video. Briefly, Xi Jinping, China's leader, is flying to Saudi Arabia, and he's going to meet there with the Crown Prince, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and no doubt he'll also be meeting King Salman himself. And this comes shortly after a major agreement between the Chinese National Oil Company and the Saudis. And I can't help but think that the ultimate objective, the whole purpose of this visit by Xi Jinping is to facilitate Saudi Arabia's application or pending application to join the BRICS group. This is this big global alternative to the West's G7 group led by China and Russia, which Saudi Arabia is apparently now showing an interest in joining. Now, the key point to understand about this is that we know, because the Chinese and the Russians have told us about it, that the Chinese and the Russians and the other BRICS countries are now working on setting up a reserve currency as an alternative to the dollar. And this reserve currency will be based on a basket of currencies of the BRICS group. And if Saudi Arabia were to join the BRICS, then it would presumably be participating in this new reserve currency system. And if it were to participate in this new reserve currency system, logically, it would demand payment for its oil exports in that reserve currency system. And that would mean that it would no longer be selling its oil for dollars. It would be the end of the petrodollar. Now, the petrodollar is not the same as the reserve currency status of the dollar, but it is an important part of the international global trading system which secures the dollar's position as the global reserve currency. Oil is the most widely traded commodity. Everybody has to buy oil. No modern economy can operate, no economy anywhere can operate without oil. So people have to use the dollar to buy oil. Countries, states, governments, companies have to have dollars in order to buy oil, because up to this time, oil is traded in dollars. Now, if that is no longer the case, if oil is no longer traded in dollars or only in dollars, if it is also traded in this reserve currency, then countries around the world, governments around the world, companies around the world will have to also hold some of their foreign currency holdings in this new BRICS reserve currency so that they can buy oil. And if most oil is traded in this BRICS reserve currency, then they're going to hold, by definition, fewer dollars and more of this currency so that they can buy this oil. And that is a major step towards replacing the dollar as the world's global reserve currency. It would provide an alternative to the dollar's position as a reserve currency. So I'm not suggesting it's going to happen tomorrow or next year or immediately or even very soon. But one can see a pattern of connections being established, and it seems to me that Xi Jinping, furious as he must be over the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, is now taking another significant step in that direction. Relations between the China and the Saudis have historically always been very close. They became very close friends in the 1980s, at a time, by the way, when the Soviet Union did not have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. The Chinese even sold missiles at that time to the Saudis. So they have a long relationship, a historic relationship, and Xi Jinping is no doubt coming to Saudi Arabia very much with that purpose in mind, to facilitate Saudi Arabia's entry into the BRICS system in order, brick by brick, if you like, to build this new global financial architecture based around this BRICS currency, with Saudi Arabia participating in it, selling its oil in it, getting the other Gulf producers to do the same, and thereby providing, for the first time, a serious challenge to the dollar. So we live in very exciting, very interesting times. Much, no doubt, to discuss. We see the direction of the war in Ukraine. We see the new economic infrastructure being constructed. And of course, at the Duran and on this channel, we will continue to discuss these developments as they evolve. In the meantime, this is the end of my video today. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find me on other platforms. You can find all our Duran videos on other platforms. Locals is our main alternative platform, but you can also find us on Telegram and also on Rumble and other places too. And you can, of course, also support our work via PayPal. Sorry, not PayPal at all. PayPal is ended with us, but Patreon and Subscribestar. And of course, you can also go to our shop, buy the great things you will find there, our t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, hats, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to take the like button and please check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day until we speak again.